doting parent? You're kind of proud of your kids. You like your kids. I am. I love my daughter and son-in-law. I saw the picture she posted on Facebook this week and can't believe that I have a grandson that's a senior and a granddaughter who's a sophomore in high school. I still remember being up at DuPont Hospital when they were born. That was just 2 weeks ago. But I love my kids. We had a wonderful privilege this summer of having them here. Cecily and the kids were here for a little over a week, and Aaron was here a little shorter period of time because he had to go back and go to work. That's one thing I greatly appreciate about him. He's a provider for his family. And he's in a tough industry right now because he's a mortgage loan officer. But God has blessed him. He's got a organization he works with that he has a lot of favor, and he is a producer. So it's just kind of neat to see. And then Cecily is thriving. They're a part of a very large church called the Oaks in Dallas. And Cecily works with their worship pastor and with their pastoral care pastor. And her position is called coordinator. What that basically means is they get all the glory and she does all the work. She does all the logistical things that make worship happen in that church, and that's a major thing there. And then their pastoral care for a congregation of probably 4,000 or 5,000 people total. And so I'm so proud of how she does what she does. My grandkids, yeah, they're teenagers, but I just see such potential in who they're going to be. Very different personalities, just totally different from each other. Andrew has become a consummate fisherman. And so he's all the time, he could tell you every pond in their neighborhood that's worth fishing in and every one that's not. And Bella is going to somewhere rule and reign an empire that I don't know who her subjects will be, but God have mercy on them. No, at an early age, about 10 years old, she really began to express a call to be a missionary. Ironically, within just a few weeks after she had expressed that, at 10 years old, Bella had a stroke. We were all shocked. But we began to pray. This church prayed, their church prayed, other people prayed. And within a matter of months, there was no real evidence that she had had anything happen, because God did a major work, and I'm convinced that she's going to make a difference for God somewhere in missions around the world. But it was fun. We had them with us. And Aaron flew in differently from the rest of the family because of his schedule, so he actually flew into Fort Wayne. I picked him up at the airport. He and I immediately drove to Indianapolis to pick up Cecily and the kids. But the fun thing was that I had a couple of hours, and just Aaron and I had some great time together we haven't had for a while. And it was just so delightful to me to get to spend time with him. And then Cecily and I, we were blessed because there's a ministry here for pastors that provides time away at a lake. Beautiful house. And they have a pontoon boat, they have jet skis, and they make all that available to pastors and their families. So we were able to have that privilege. And on Sunday afternoon, we'd head up there, or Sunday noon, and Aaron and the kids were at the house, and Grace was here in town because she still had to work some during that time too. So Cecily and I went into the little town close to where the lake is to buy groceries for the house that week. And we found just a little pizza place that's unique to that small town. And I can't tell you how wonderful it was to just spend about an hour, just me and my girl. She's still my baby, even though she's not a little kid anymore. And just to be able to have that time with her. And then to watch the grandkids put down their phones and actually do something besides just be on their phones. And to hear Andrew, I held my breath a little bit when he was steering the pontoon boat back onto the rack that it goes on to take it out of the water. But I'm telling you, he did it picture perfect. And then he had never been on a jet ski in his life. And I think he spent about 400 hours on the jet ski that week. It was just neat. And then Bella, being who Bella is, just added flavor to every day with her observations, with her insights. And it was just so fun. One of the evenings when Grace and Cecily and I were around the fire pit there while the kids were kind of back and forth between the water. Aaron had already come back, and Grace and Cecily and I just had a wonderful time sitting around the fire pit, being family. My family, to me, is a delight. And we're in this series right now on Sabbath perspectives. What does it mean to have Sabbath? We talked a couple of weeks ago about the concept of stopping. How do you let go of the pace? How do you let go of all the busyness and just stop? And then last week we talked about the element of Sabbath that relates to rest. Reinvigorating, refreshing. There's another perspective of Sabbath that I want you to look at with me today, which is delight. And what I just shared with you about our family, I believe for me was a part of that spiritual delight. It wasn't just that I liked them, it's that it was a spiritual part of that time to actually just delight in who they are. You know God was on it when Andrew and Bella got through a week without any significant fights over except one thing, and that was which of the bedrooms they were going to get. And Bella didn't quite play the cards right, and she had to let go. It was fun watching her do that. That's how I know God was in it, because she let go. But it just is a wonderful thing to see delight. And I want us to look at that today. Our theme for this whole series is Hebrews 4, 9, and 10. We conclude that there is still a full and complete Sabbath rest waiting for believers to experience. As we enter into God's faith rest life, we cease from our own works just as God celebrates His finished work and rest in them. I think this is so timely for the culture you and I are a part of. Because never has there been more ways for us to relax, and never has there been more stress on people than the world you and I live in. The stress of how you're going to get it all done. The stress of all the stuff we need to accumulate, and then how do you maintain it once you get it? The stress of all of the chaos around us. And so our lives tend to go from crisis to crisis to crisis, from emergency to emergency to emergency, from pressure to pressure to pressure. And a question I have for you today is how much of your life is delightful? And have you learned in the middle of this kind of a culture to find how to have delight that centers in who God is and your relationship with Him? So the theme verse for today is Psalm 118:24. This is the very day of the Lord that brings gladness and joy, filling our hearts with glee. You may have heard it this way. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Ever heard that one before? How do we find Sabbath in the world for delight. You'll remember we've talked about the fact that when we talk about Sabbath, we talk about elements of time in the course of every day. We talk about the idea of Sabbath being a day set aside in the week. And then seasons with Sabbath, so that we maybe get a vacation from work and we schedule away just some real downtime, or some other form of more extended Sabbath. All of those elements, how do we do those, and how do we bring this concept of having delight? I believe that delight that we come up with because it makes us happy is not real solid. It's very hollow. Because you can be happy and just a little small thing can suddenly turn that emotion and you're not happy anymore. I think the better concept of what ties to this is not so much happiness as it is joy. Because joy is not based in what's happening right this minute that makes me feel good. Joy is something that has a far deeper substance to it and is totally connected, in my opinion, with us having solid relationship with God. So how do we come to this place that we begin to let God's delight begin to then trickle into all the areas of our life, so that delight in us comes out of this time with God, and when we have this type of Sabbath, that we have it as a part of being connected to God, not as something that has just made us happy for a moment. And we were at the lake. Andrew was having a ton of fun on the jet ski till he came in and said, "It's out of gas." All of a sudden, it's not much fun. The good news for him was he was smart enough to pay attention, so he was back at shore when that happened, not somewhere out in the middle of the lake. So much of what we look at is tied to things out of our control. How do we find delight that goes beyond? And I believe that the first place we find this perspective of Sabbath, of delight, is finding delight in worships. Isaiah 61:10. I will sing and greatly rejoice in Yahweh. My whole being vibrates with shouts of joy in my God, for he's dressed me with salvation and wrapped me in the robe of his righteousness. I appear like a bridegroom on his wedding day, decked out with a beautiful sash, or like a radiant bride adorned with sparkling jewels. Any of you married folks remember your wedding day? Were you so worried about everything else you couldn't actually enjoy it? I think we were about halfway into the ceremony when Grace and I got married, when I finally just relaxed and decided, this is incredible. This beautiful woman is still full enough. She's saying, "I do." And she's going to get the privilege of walking with me the rest of her life, whatever that means. And here we are years later, and I'm still pretty excited about her. And I have more depth to that than the day we got married. So what do we do to let delight filter into every part of our life? It begins with this concept of worshiping God. And when you come to worship God, I think the starting place, the beginning of this, is when we begin to reflect on the big picture of the goodness of God. Aren't you thankful that God created the world that you and I have the privilege of being a part of, with all of the idiosyncrasies? It's still a pretty neat place. I don't know about you, but I like living in Indiana. Florida is great to be in January. Right now, you better have shorts, and you better not plan anything outside after 10 o'clock in the morning, or you're just going to be drenched in sweat. Because the humidity will be about 99%, and the temperature will be about 96. And unless you're right on the water, that is not a pleasant experience. So how do you look at the goodness of God? and you see the things of the natural world around us. You look and you see what God's done, and we begin to think of His goodness. I just reflected on my family, and I'm so grateful to God. It's part of His goodness to me. This church is part of the goodness of God in my life. Health and strength is part of the goodness of God. And so when I decide I'm going to worship God, that's a place to get started, is just begin to be thankful for the goodness that you have and begin to express that, begin to verbalize it, begin to share it. And what happens is as you do that, it shifts from the broad praise of God, the creator of the world, to now the specifics of things God's done for you. Ways that He's blessed your life. And you think back over the ways that God has done amazing things through the years. And as you give praise to God, your praise becomes testimony, becomes witness to what God has done. And without going into a long explanation of this, the word testimony literally means do it again. So as we're praising God, what we're doing, we're saying, God, I'm so grateful for what you've done. And I'm so grateful because I believe you're going to do it again. You're going to return again more blessing into my life. You're going to bring more fulfillment. You're going to bring more of the goodness of who you are, that I'm going to experience what that means. And then there's a point as you begin to get into this delight in worship that it needs to transition from praise for what He has done to worship for who He is. That we begin to recognize this is the omniscient God. He knows everything. This is the omnipotent God. He has all power. We begin to worship Him for who He is and for His love, for His mercy, His long-suffering, His kindness. All of those characteristics that define who God is, we begin to worship Him for that. And what happens is we begin to worship Him for who He is. It takes us into a whole deeper level. And what it does, it takes us into what we talked about last week, where we connect into the depth of who we are, because inside, deep within us, Christ lives. He's in our spirit, in the very depth of who we are. And He is literally a well of water that springs forth into a river of life out of us. And that's where delight in worship comes to a place that's far beyond anything we can just describe. I, without any question, can take you back and tell you the moment that I personally experienced at an amazing level what I'm talking to you about this morning. I've experienced it at levels before, but at this level of just complete abandonment to God, I always come back to a night when we were having a Monday night experience. And that particular night, we were in this room for the Monday night experience. And I was standing right in front of this platform, leaning back against it. And we had kind of finished the evening, but there was just a time I think I just said, if you just want to spend some time with God, just do that. And so whoever was running the tech that night put on that song from Matt Redman, 10,000 Reasons. And it just began to play. And as it began to play, I was down here, and before long I found myself just lost in the words of that song. And my hands went up, and I just began to have the rivers of life begin to flow through me. And it was just an amazing experience. And I think it went on for at least 45 minutes to an hour after that had started, way beyond the time. There were still a few people here at the end of that. And this was a long time ago. I remember my son-in-law Aaron was here. And literally, I finally came to a place and I said, well, I guess we should go home, shouldn't we? And I tried to stand up and I couldn't. I was so overwhelmed with the presence of God. I've heard the expression drunk in the Spirit. And I don't know exactly what that means. All I can tell you is that's probably what it was. Because I literally was barely able to move because I was so saturated with the goodness of God. Bless the Lord, O my soul. All that is within me, bless his holy name, took on a whole new definition for me that night. Literally to the point that finally Aaron looked at me and he said, "You're not driving home." He took me home that night, slept like a baby. Never will forget that. Never had that duplicated. I've had experiences that have been profound. That's probably the one that I point back and say that's the most profound experience of finding delight in God in worship. Now here's probably the shame on me. You know why that happened? Because that night I decided nothing else mattered. And I began to connect with the message of the words that were in that song. And I began to just make God my complete focus without any thought of what else needed to be done, where else I could go, what else could be happening. And I delighted in God. Could I challenge you to look at your life and see where do you have room for that to happen? The magic wasn't in that song, even though that song was powerful. Another song that really impacts me is the song "I Speak Jesus" from Charity Gale. It just really, really speaks to me. What are songs that speak to you? And where are the places that you just get alone and delight in worship? Because I contend this, that if we are to experience delight related to coming from God and not coming out of our happiness as a person, but from the joy of the Lord in our life, it has to begin with the delight in God. It has to begin by the delight in worship with Him. Because everything else in our life, every other relationship in our life, spawns out of us being connected in our innermost being with God. And that then causes us to be able, once we begin to connect that and we begin to experience that, that then helps us to find delight in relationship with others. Psalm 133:1. How truly wonderful and delightful it is to see brothers and sisters living together in sweet unity. I wish that every church body in America flowed in unity. Being in unity doesn't mean that you agree about everything. How many right now think that it's just a little bit too cold in here? Okay? How many of you think it's just a little bit warm? All the coffee drinkers. How many of you think it's okay? It's just perfect. Well, the perfect majority seems to have it, but it doesn't discredit the opinions of the people who think it's too cold or too hot. But we don't look and say, "You mean you think it's too warm in here? I'm not going to sit by you in church anymore, or I'm not coming to this church." We don't let that keep us separated. We celebrate the individuality of who we are, and yet we come together, and the unity in us is the unity of being connected in Christ. It's the purpose of God's kingdom. That's what unifies us and brings us into delightful relationship. And so, what are you doing to bring delight in your marriage partner, and that you live in a deep awareness of the Trinity of marriage? What do I mean by that? Marriage is not just a union between a man and woman. Because a two-stranded cord can be broken pretty easily. A three-stranded cord, you just can't break very easily. And when a couple each have relationship with Christ, and then they make Christ priority in their home, now you have a Trinity relationship in marriage that adds a strength to it. The challenge you have is when you have one who really is eager for the things of God and one that isn't. And then you've got conflict that comes. You can't fix that in the other person. All you can do is do what you can to live out what it means to build marriage relationship into a delight. And I wish I could tell you that that's happening in every home in our body, but I'm smart enough to know it's not. Whatever you can do to work through that and whatever you can do to strengthen it, I encourage you to. If you can't because the other person refuses, then you're going to have to trust it to God, because sometimes you can't fix it. Sometimes the marriage isn't going to make it because of the choices they're making. Does that mean God's failed? No. Does that mean you're not doing your part? No. It just means that sometimes when our wills get in the way and you have a person who's not willing to work on it, it's not going to work. But if you have two people who are committed, what are you doing to take that commitment beyond verbal affirmation into literally living into what do I do to build a strong bond of relationship that creates delight for my home? And how do I delight in intentional connection with my family? How do I connect with my kids, with your parents? How do you connect with cousins and aunts and uncles? You know, a few years ago, the popular word became dysfunctional. And we began to talk about dysfunctional relationships and dysfunctional families. You know what I have come to the conclusion after all these years? I think almost everybody is a little dysfunctional. And I think almost every family has dysfunction in it. So do you look and say, okay, then that means we're destined and doomed? Or do you look and say, you know, there may be dysfunction, but how do I focus on the function? And how do I look at what can be healthy and what can be delightful in what it means to be part of this family? So that you begin to see delight in what God can do and how God can work and what He can bring as joy between family members and how He can help you work through the things you can't change, through the people that are just going to be difficult, through the crazy Aunt Sally. Whatever the person that may be causing issues, you still come back to how do you live in a way that you begin to find delight in your family? And how do you delight in intentionally connecting with your church family? You know, I love days like the cookout we had a few weeks ago where we all got together, just had a good time, and we got to enjoy food and being together. I can't wait for the birthday bash in a couple of weeks because we'll have church. Then we're going to have incredible pulled pork. We're going to have hot dogs. I understand we're going to have snow cones. I mean, man, what more could you ask for? Oh, I know bounce houses. They're going to be here too. So it's just going to be a great time for us to be together and delight in being family in the body of Christ. How do we delight in friendships? Who are the people in your life that bring the joy of God out in you, that you can begin to develop that with? And how do you delight in some intentional connection with your neighbors and your coworkers? What do you do to go out of your way? The other night, I'm out in the backyard doing a couple of things that need to be done. And I looked over and I saw my next door neighbors sitting out on the new deck he just built. And they're out there just enjoying time together. And I did what any good believer ought to do. I just went over and interrupted them and said, hey, how are you guys doing? And they were glad I did, because there's this camaraderie in the last few years that's begun to grow in our neighborhood. And a lot of it's fuel with the couple who moved in next door to us and their little kids. Little Mary Beth started kindergarten last week. And I go outside, I know my day's going to be better because I usually hear the voice before I see the face. When I hear, Mr. Bill! And it's little Mary Beth, or now her younger sister, Julianne. Their little brother, Andrew, who whatever he gets in his hand is a club he hits them with. He's just a little over 2 years old. And Thomas is going to be a piece of work. But you know, it just brightens my day. I delight in our neighborhood. How do we begin to look and let that become a Sabbath principle that's in our lives in every element of relationship? And then how do we find delight in engagement in the things we do? Colossians 3:23, put your heart and soul into every activity you do as though you're doing it for the Lord himself and not merely for others. How do we begin to delight in recognizing and then engaging in whatever God-given creativity you have? What has God blessed you with that you can do that blesses others because of your creativity? And it gives you delight to use your creativity, and it becomes a blessing to others. Kelly, every day I think about the handiwork you did for us that now we have in our house and a beautiful comforter because of your creativity and handiwork. What's the creativity God's blessed you with that you can bless others with, that you can utilize, that you can bring glory and you begin to bring delight in taking advantage of what God's given you ability to do? What's delight in productive activity that releases a sense of accomplishment so that when you get through, you feel good about it? I remember this spring when I think I got them at Home Depot, 2 little bitty plants that on the side of the container, they had a little stick inside them, a little plastic stick that said some kind of cucumbers. I bought those little bitty plants, put the 2 out in my big garden that's about 10 by 10 and has 6 plants in it. Well, and then some kale and parsley for grace. But those little cucumbers, you know what I was doing yesterday? One of them, I bought cages to go around them. Both of them have outgrown the cage. So I bought these 6-foot-long stakes. And now one of them has surpassed the 6-foot stake, and I still had some old bamboo stakes that I'd used before. And I literally tied a couple of the bamboo stakes on top of the 6-foot stakes so that now back in my yard, you're looking 10 feet up in the air stakes, and guess what? Those cucumber plants have grown nearly to the top of the 10-foot stakes. Is it an artwork to look at? Probably not. But to me, it's a masterpiece. I did that. I planted those little plants. And then the harvest of cucumbers, I am literally Grace's primary source of product for her smoothies these days. And just as soon as she pays me for all I've contributed to that, but it just feels good to be productive and have that sense of accomplishment. And delight in some form of how you serve in the community. We have so many people who are part of LifeBridge that serve here in church and beyond. All of our volunteers, we're so grateful to what you do and how you're involved in church and then how you get involved in other areas and serving the community. All of that, when you can do it as a delight, it just brings pleasure to do that. It's a part of bringing rest into a stressful world. Because now you're not doing it because you've got a boss to please. You're not doing it because you need a paycheck. You're doing it because you get this satisfaction of serving the Lord, but it's serving others unto the Lord. And then how do you find delight in nature? Psalms 19, verse 1. God's glory is on tour in the skies. God craft on exhibit across the horizon. Madam Day holds classes every morning. Professor Knight lectures each evening. Their words aren't heard, their voices aren't recorded, but their silence fills the earth. Unspoken truth is spoken everywhere. God makes a huge dome for the sun, a superdome. The morning sun's a new husband leaping from his honeymoon bed. The day-breaking sun, an athlete racing to the tape. If you are bored reading the Bible, read it from the Message. So how do you delight in just the reflection of the beauty of nature, places you've been, things you've had the privilege of seeing? I've had the wonderful privilege of traveling a number of places. I remember when Grace and I went to Niagara Falls a few years ago. I'd never been there before. Man, pretty big. Went to the Grand Canyon a couple of times. The only person I know that's not impressed with that is Tonya Hunt. She says it's just a big hole in the ground. And she's right. But it's pretty amazing. The one thing I haven't yet done that I want to do there is literally get in a helicopter and fly through the canyon. If I go back, that's what I'll do. Grace and I had the privilege of going to Foursquare Conference in Hawaii a few years ago and staying a few days extra and seeing the wonders of nature. When you look at the leftover lava from where volcanoes erupted, isn't that amazing? Every element of what you see, if you're in Colorado, the mountains, if you're in the fall season in the Carolinas, there's just so many things to see. The seasonal beauty, delight in some way where you go to look for a natural wonder phenomenon. Sometimes it's just the smell of rain. Have you ever noticed what a wonderful smell that is when rain begins to fall? Or just you see a bird, or in the morning at our house you hear the birds singing. I don't know what's more fun, is to watch the birds singing or watch our cat Maggie go nuts. But there's just delight. And how do we delight in these natural senses God gave us that now we experience so much? The sights to see, sunsets. Well, I used to live in Fort Myers. And you walk along the Gulf Coast in the evening and watch the sunset over the water. It's gorgeous. What is it like when you see wildflowers just outgrowing beside the road? In Texas, bluebonnets in the spring just grow along the side of the road. Nobody plants them but God. And then the foods that you taste. I tell you, if you haven't ever been to Los Cabos, be sure you get the guacamole when you go there. It's to die for. And then, as I said a few weeks ago, I've learned the different kinds of coffee and the ways that you can enjoy that. I still love good blackberry cobbler, topped off with some Blue Velvet vanilla ice cream. Anybody ready for lunch yet? Things that you touch. There's just something special when I'm sitting, not paying attention, and I feel this little wet nose against my arm, and I look, and there's our cat Maggie. She does things at her own whim. And when she decides she needs her ear scratched, she'll come get my attention because I'm in charge of that. Unless she doesn't want it. Just something about that. And I don't even like cats. It's a miracle. Nothing like wrapping up a warm blanket when you've turned the air conditioning in the house to 66 so it'll be cold when you sleep. Sounds of the birds chirping, rain hitting the rooftop, the scents that you smell, candles. Have you ever been to a Krispy Kreme donut shop when the red light is on? I'm going to tell you, I have a feeling that Krispy Kreme has the contract for dessert at the marriage supper of the Lamb in heaven. Because when that donut starts to melt in your mouth, there is nothing better than another one to follow it. taste. How do we delight in these things? For me, I have an outdoor sanctuary in what I do with yard and landscaping. It's funny how I think of the things that I want to do my yard work with and the things to our landscaping, and I go through all this thought process of how I'm going to convince our accountant that it will be a good investment to buy some of the tools I want. And she's really coming around. And she's let me do quite a few things that I'm real happy with. And the truth is, I could do them anyway, but I want her to be happy about it too, you know. But I love the stuff that I do in my yard. There's even something powerful about killing dandelions so you can have a beautiful grass. And those of you who love dandelions, get over it. But we want to look and see what are the ways that we can enjoy. I mentioned a couple weeks ago, I now love sitting on our deck with our new solo fire pit and just watch the smoke go straight up. That just fascinates me. How'd they engineer that? How'd that work? And yet it's just an incredible experience. I can't wait for this fall to have some cooler weather. I actually did it the other day when it was 75 degrees. You just stand a little further back. But those are all part of this delighting. So as we look at this Sabbath perspectives, how do you begin to incorporate delight? Tied to the worship of God, but expressed in so many ways, because after all, everything I've just talked about are all byproducts of what God did when He set the world in motion. So as we delight in every one of these elements, what are we back doing? We're back delighting in God. And Sabbath means that we stop the bus and get off. So that instead of living in the cycle of the routine, break away and we make room for how we can delight in intentional worship, in intentionally cultivating relationship, in intentionally engaging in our creativity, and intentionally engaging in nature. All of that is how we come to delight. And here's what happens. This whole idea of Sabbath is about abiding in God. Being. Not doing, being. And when we begin to delight, here's the amazing thing. As you learn to delight God's way, and it doesn't become about happiness, it becomes about joy. Happiness will be a byproduct, but it's not the focus. Because happiness can be shifted just like that. Joy carries you. Because, as Nehemiah says, the joy of the Lord is my strength. There is something I'm believing God for us as a church. Back in 2006, Pastor Jack Hayford stood on this platform and preached the dedication message for this building after it was built. And I'll never forget, he had been with us in the morning service. We'd had a lunch with leadership in the church. And then we were coming back for a dedication service that a number of other pastors and community leaders participated in, and Pastor Jack preached. As we're sitting at lunch, I noticed he took his napkin and he began to just write and scratch notes on it. And when he got up to speak that afternoon, Pastor Jack said, I had a very prepared message that I was going to deliver this afternoon. And when I was sitting at lunch today, God began to say to me, that's not what I want you to say. Here's what I want you to say. And so he said, I just jotted down a few notes. Because he says, I believe God has a prophetic word for LifeBridge Church in the city of Fort Wayne. And he began to unpack the message that was built around this concept of the joy of the Lord will be my strength. That message, by the way, is on the resource page of our website. I would encourage you to go watch it and hear what Pastor Jack had to say. Because I truly believe if we begin to practice this perspective of Sabbath called delight, what Pastor Jack spoke of in 2006 will begin to unfold as we begin the next 20 years of LifeBridge Church. We're going to wrap up 20 September 8th, and we're going to launch the next trajectory for whatever God has. Wouldn't it be phenomenal if this became a church that people said, what do you like about LifeBridge? Well, they delight in God. You know, the joy of the Lord makes them such a strong church. What would happen if we did that for ourselves individually, and then collectively we begin to shift this community, this nation, this world? It's an election year. And frankly, I know a lot of people are just altogether uptight over which ways it's going to go. You do need to pray. You do need to vote. But I don't know how to tell you this. However the election goes is not nearly as important as what I'm talking to you about this morning. Because if we learn what I'm talking about, whatever happens, we will be God's guard in the middle of a world that desperately needs the hope of the gospel. Because it is the gospel of Jesus Christ that changes the world, not a political party. So God help us to be people who understand how to delight in the Lord. Say it with me. This is the day that the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it.